You're now listening to Protecting Your Nest with board-certified family medicine and obesity medicine specialist Dr. Tony Hampton. For more, visit drtonyhampton.com. Welcome to the Protecting Your Nest podcast, where we are on a journey to better understand the root causes of disease, which will equip all of us as we try to avoid the things that are harming us and, of course, add the things to our lives that are helping us. During our last podcast, we discussed the importance of nutrition as it relates to dementia with Amy Berger. So if you have any family members with dementia or are concerned about it yourself, that's an episode you really don't want to miss. And I'll make sure to share that in the show notes. Today, we continue our focus on root cause by focusing on the N in our nest as we talk about food addictions. But if we're dealing with addictions, I think we will clearly need to target other aspects of the nest and the rope as well, since food addictions have so many aspects that impact how they are managed. For example, the T in nest is how we think. The R in the rope is for relationships. And some would suggest to include the P in the rope, which deals with pollution, because processed foods are a form of pollution to our bodies. And of course, the E in the rope is for both emotions and our life experiences. All of these factors are likely important in overcoming processed food addictions and should clearly help you see why I feel in order for us to, kind of achieve our metabolic health goals, we must address all of these issues. So to help us connect the dots today, I want to introduce an expert in the area of food addiction, and should I say processed food addiction, and that's Joan Ifland.
Hey there.
Hey, how you doing? So welcome. And Joan, I really appreciate you being with us. And I'm gonna kind of give a little bit of a bio so everybody knows a little bit about you. But I appreciate your enthusiasm in this area because so many people need to understand what processed food addiction is. And I think for some of us, until you showed up, we had never heard of it. So let me give a little bit of a bio and then we'll get you back in this conversation. Dr. Ifland actually created breakthroughs in recovery from food addiction starting back in 1999 with her first popular book to 2018 with her textbook entitled Processed Food Addiction, Foundations, Assessment, and Recovery, which was published by CRC Press. She is currently at work on evidence-based trainings, thank God for that, for healthcare professionals like myself. Dr. Ifland is a fellow of the American College of Nutrition and earned her PhD in addictive nutrition at Union Institute and University in 2010. Her MBA was at Stanford Business School in 1978, and her BA in economics and political science at Oberlin College 1974. I like those small liberal arts colleges, by the way. I'm a big fan.
Yeah.
I love them. She was selected by the Oprah Winfrey Network as a food addiction specialist on the Book of John Gray. She has innovated in online services such as the Addiction Reset Community, also ARC, in 2016. Which can be found at www.foodaddictionreset.com. She has also founded sites which provide free services, including Facebook group, and I really appreciate that. Food Addiction Education, that's in 2014, and handouts at www.addictionresources.com since 2014. Reset Week is the first online live video program for withdrawal from processed foods since 2018. And Dr. Ifland's Meal Prep Manual is a breakthrough system to easily manage meals since 2018, which resolves a major barrier to recovery from food addiction. So I'm just loving all of this. Now, before we go go ahead and start our conversation, I want to do a FYI. And I noticed that when I looked at the virtual San Diego 2020 Metabolic Health Conference, I saw your face along with mine. So in August, between the 27th and 30th of 2020, the Low Carb USA will have their annual Low Carb Conference. So if you haven't signed up for that, go to www.lowcarbusa.org to register. And for those folk looking for CME, get about 28 CME. And for other clinicians looking for CME in other fields, there's some continuing education, should I say, for you as well. I think it's about $79, but it's so worth it. And it's a virtual conference. So I'm looking forward to virtually share knowledge with Joan as well. So Joan, again, thank you for joining us today, being a pioneer in the processed food addiction space. I have a whole lot of family members, team members, and others who I told them we have to make sure you hear this episode, because I think so many of us at the minimum need to know if this is who we are. So maybe the best way to get started is for you to kind of introduce yourself to our listeners and maybe go back a little bit. Go back to those days when you were younger and just talk a little bit about how you got interested in processed food addiction and or how it's affected you in your personal journey.
Oh, thank you, Tony. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate being here. Processed food addiction is a devastating condition. A lot of people have it. It was spread by the same business model that spread tobacco smoking to 2/3 of American adults at its height. So once people get this idea that they have this, all an addiction is are reward neurons that have been trained to release a lot of dopamine in response to triggers. And once you know it's something that it's straightforward in terms of the mechanics. It's not straightforward in terms of protecting the brain from triggers and cueing. But once you know that that's all it is, you can get right to work and get the right kind of support and education to make it stop. And of course, addictions can be put into remission. This particular addiction is made more serious, if you will, because it starts in childhood. So, this is the first era of history in which addictive substances have been cheap enough to be profitable enough to sell to children. And with the advent of television, I call them addiction marketers. They're the kinds of people who have PhDs in the psychology of marketing. So they go to these fancy schools and they study hard, and those methods include, understanding how to impact the brain. So brain neurons are very trainable. You don't have to show them something more than a couple of times typically before they remember it and then they react. So as a child, I had food addiction. I didn't know it, of course. I didn't know I had a food addiction until I was 44 years old. But for all of those years, I craved. And craving is one of the diagnostic criteria for an addiction developed by the American Psychiatric Association and published in their diagnostic manual. So I can remember going to kindergarten and craving so badly. At home, I could just go in the kitchen and I could get addictive substances. I could make a white bread sandwich with margarine and sugar anytime I wanted. There was no restriction on me, even as a small child. So I could go and get that. And when I got to kindergarten, I couldn't do that. I didn't have that opportunity. So I felt hungry. I wasn't actually hungry, I was craving. And I remember looking around the kindergarten room and figuring out I could eat my chapstick. This was the mid-1950s, so paste was still made from flour and water, and I knew I could eat that. And I did. I would just take these, I'd hide it and just take these little tiny bites of whatever. But I was desperate, even as a child, with these cravings. I watched Saturday morning cartoons and all those commercials on those programs using cartoon characters had an impact on me. They made me crave. They trained my reward system to crave the same substances being used by the cartoon characters: sugars, gluten, flour, dairy, excessive salt, and even caffeine in chocolate. Breakfast cereals are highly addictive, and we had them all in our house. We would ask our mother to buy them, and she would. So this is something that people just cannot get their heads wrapped around. That our government, for example, would let these tobacco addiction merchants market sugar to our children, but they do. And we got some brand new evidence for this last year from the University of California, San Francisco, which is examining the documents that the tobacco corporations were required to submit to the courts and publishing on them. So last year they published a report on an internal document describing an addiction business model called surround marketing, where you give the person samples of the addictive substance and therefore without their knowledge, you start training the neurons in the reward system to respond to that addictive substance and then to cues or triggers associated with the substance. So first you addict the neurons and then you surround the person with reminders or triggers or cues, stimulation that without the person's consent or even knowledge are activating neurons in their brain to release floods of dopamine or serotonin, or in the case of marijuana and processed fats, endocannabinoids and opiates. So these are the brain's own addicted neurotransmitters. They're supposed to be giving us pleasure. They're supposed to be giving us pleasure in response to a lot of different things. But the addiction scientists, these highly trained PhD psychology of marketing scientists, have hijacked them. They've kidnapped these neurons. They enslaved them is another word for it. The root of the word addiction is enslavement. So they've enslaved these neurons to react to then signals. And then they load up the household with these signals. So these signals for this addiction are inside the house. They are things like copious quantities of addictive substances, like the huge boxes of snack foods, the huge containers of ice cream and potato chips and breakfast cereals and cookies, these quote unquote family size. Well, that's just a strategy to get the product into the house for long periods of time, because that excites these neurons and creates the cravings, just the availability of it. So it's the same way that they had people putting cigarettes in the upper pocket of their shirt, 20 cigarettes at a time, so that their constant availability was triggering these cravings. It's very, very hard to believe that people would actually do this deliberately. But this paper that UCSF published last year just laid it out beautifully. The description, this is the business document was created in 1963 when R.J. Reynolds, which is a tobacco company, bought Hawaiian Punch, and transferred this surround marketing to sugar.
So the tobacco companies actually are purchasing the food companies, and they use the same scientists they use to help us to get addicted to cigarettes. They use
Yep.
the same people to then help us become addicted to foods. The same rich tobacco companies. That's an amazing revelation.
It's really shocking, but we have really good documentation on it. And then Michael Moss's book, Sugar, Fat, Salt. I think he did hundreds of interviews for that book. It's really thorough. He actually sits down with these people and interviews them again and again about what they did specifically. One of them in particular, Howard Moskowitz, he does have a PhD in the psychology of marketing from Harvard. This is where he learned to do it. And what he learned to do was to ramp up, maximize the amount of sugar, fat, salt in products, the maximum amount before the consumer would reject them. And he went through all the processed food manufacturers. Once one of them did it, then all the other ones had to follow. He re engineered, reformulated innocent products like tomato sauce. By the time he got finished with it, it was loaded with sugar and became addictive. So it's laid out in chilling detail. The assault on children is shocking. Marion Nestle, in her book Food Politics, refers to a study where this researcher just simply counted up the number of Saturday morning cartoon commercials for sugary, fatty, salty foods after tobacco purchases the big food manufacturers in the mid 1980s. And it goes from like 160 to about 560 in about 7 years, from 1985 to 1992. And you see the childhood obesity rates in the United States go from 10% to 15% in 10 years. So we know that this incredible load of cueing, Pavlovian conditioning of neurons, 500 commercials in one morning, was carried by Nickelodeon to 65 million households. So people say, oh, this couldn't possibly be. No, they couldn't possibly be able to do that. There must be some other reason. Oh, no. When you look at those kinds of numbers, that kind of reach, and then you look at research done at Stanford on how many commercials does it take to influence a toddler's choice. Very simple research. Toddlers watched a 1 hour program. Half the toddlers saw 5 commercials during that 1 hour. The other half did not see any. Same program. They put all the toddlers in a room with a whole bunch of different products. The toddlers who had seen the 5 commercials went for that product. The toddlers who hadn't seen any commercials picked out a lot of different products. So we know that it only takes 5 commercials to influence a toddler to go and start bugging the parents for a product. And there they were seeing 500.
Wow.
It is so clear. It's like this is the kind of
It's so
toothpaste. Once you
clear.
get this out of the tube, you
Right.
cannot put it back in. Suddenly everything is clear.
Everything seems clear, but my question to me, I remember just casually looking around, and we both do Twitter, and sometimes people push back. So if we have clinicians listening, and I guess even the average person, is there, I mean, the idea that food addictions are real, clearly the marketing to people are real and to our babies. But, what would you say to somebody that doesn't believe that a food addiction is a real thing and that it's really more about willpower and those types of things?
Well, we have the textbook now. In 2014, CRC Press, which is the biggest publisher of textbooks in the world, asked me to write the textbook for the field. I had just lost my dad, and I needed to move back to Cincinnati and look after my stepmom through the end of her life. And 3 years just opened up where I could work on it. It took me 3 years. I looked at, I don't know whether 6 or 8,000 studies, and it just was like putting together a giant jigsaw puzzle. We have the research. Why do we have so much research on food addiction when nobody's ever heard of it? It's because of the research in obesity, eating disorders, and drug addiction. We have, all you have to do is organize those studies according to things like the DSM diagnostic criteria for alcoholism. So let me explain that a little bit. For my doctoral dissertation, I validated the alcoholism diagnostic criteria for overeating. So there's just a statistical process you go through to do that. But what it shows is that there's a valid syndrome here, and it's an addiction syndrome. So in the book, I took the 11 diagnostic criteria for alcoholism, reworded them for overeating, and then I asked the question, what is the evidence? Are there studies showing that this symptom of addiction appears in overeating? And it was there. I wrote 11 chapters, there are 11 diagnostic criteria, and I just have long lists of studies about obesity typically that show that this behavior, whatever it is present in overeating. So things like unintended use, where you open a box of something, you're going to eat one and you eat the box, or you're not going to stop for fast food and you stop, or you go to the restaurant, you're not going to have dessert and then you have dessert. You wake up in the morning, I'm going to eat clean today, and you're at the vending machine by 10 o'clock. Those behaviors are documented in overeating. They are one of the signs that diagnosticians use to identify loss of control over alcohol or cocaine or marijuana or heroin. It's just something that happens when an addiction is progressing. So it's over. It's kind of like it's over. Um, Go to Amazon. The name of the book is Processed Food Addiction Foundations, Assessment, and Recovery. That debate is over.
Wow.
Yeah,
And I think that I'm so happy because in large health systems and governmental agencies, etc., you got to have some meat on the bones. And we needed this to help us to officially come to the table and say, hey, guys, here it is. And I guess, if I'm listening to this right now, I would be very curious what those criteria are. So maybe if you don't mind taking a moment and just briefly,
sure.
I know we're going to talk a little bit more. For those listening, we're going to do a YouTube, Facebook Live afterwards to go into more detail, but it'd be nice to just get a feel for what those criteria are so people listening can say, is this me or not?
Yes, thank you. So I would encourage all your listeners to hold up 11 fingers or just hold up 10 and use one of them twice.
That's right.
It is kind of shocking, but everybody who's ever talked to me about this, come for help. I ask them first to just answer these 11 questions, and they typically end up in the 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 range, which is the range for a severe addiction. So here they are. I'll just go through them quickly. The first one is what I just described, which is unintended use. You have a plan not to eat something and then you eat it. Number two is failure to cut back. And we know that 70% of Americans are overweight or obese, and they have all clearly failed to cut back. You lose the weight and then you regain it. Criteria number three is time spent. And this can creep up over time. Addictions get worse over time. So you're not just spending time actually going and getting it and sleeping it off, eating it, preparing it, etc., but you're also thinking about it all the time. So you finish breakfast and you start thinking about lunch. You finish lunch, you start thinking about dinner. You're trying to get work done at your desk and you're thinking about food. So time spent. And then number 4 is cravings. It's when you have an urge or a longing or a desire and you're not hungry. You've had your meal, but you still have these urges. Number 5, 6, and 7 are when the addiction starts to spread out into your life. You're unable to fulfill roles. Like you need to get on the floor and play with your children, but you're too large, or your joints hurt too badly, or you don't go and play with them. You give them the video because you actually want to go in the laundry room and eat whatever you have hidden there. You can't apply for promotions because you have too much brain fog and your anxiety and depression is too great. So you're having trouble fulfilling roles in your life. You don't want to volunteer anymore because you're too tired. Um, and then relationship problems. Somebody is wanting you to stop eating and you can't. Or you don't want to be with your partner because you'd rather be out in the kitchen eating something. Or you just can't wait for your household to go to sleep so that you can slip off to the laundry room and eat what you have stashed there. So relationships get into deep trouble. People start to have trouble focusing on other people. And then activities given up, it means just that you don't want to go anymore. You don't want to go to that party because you've gained some weight and you don't want people to see you, or you'd rather go home and eat, or you're too depressed or tired to be with other people, or you've lost your ability to focus and you don't really enjoy connecting with people anymore. So activities given up. And then there's one, hazardous use, driving and eating. Driving and eating used to be the most hazardous car activity, and now it's been surpassed by texting and driving. But driving and eating is quite hazardous. And you might be so big, for example, that you can no longer see your feet, and you have a risk of falling, but you can't stop eating. Or maybe you know that eating makes you very sleepy, but you still eat before you get in the car. These are all hazardous use. Um, 9, 10, 11, and 11 are about how it's affecting you kind of physiologically. 9 is use in spite of knowledge of consequences. So maybe your doctor said, look, if you keep eating this way, you're going to have a stroke, or you're going to have a heart attack, or we're going to have to start amputating toes, and you're still eating. So you've been told, you know you shouldn't be, and you're still eating. Number 10 is progression. You're just eating more than you used to. You used to stop once a week for fast food. Now you're stopping every night. You used to get 1 pint of ice cream every couple of nights. Now you're getting 3 pints per night. You used to get the small size. Now you're getting the big size. You used to be able to hold off until the evening, and now you're starting in the morning. So that's progression. That just means that those addicted neurons are becoming ever more sensitized and reactive, and releasing ever more craving neurotransmitters. And then number 11 is withdrawal. So you're eating for reasons other than hunger. You're eating because you're eating or drinking, because caffeinated sodas are very, very addictive. So you're eating or drinking to deal with a headache, or a stomach ache, or fatigue, or anger, or depression, or anxiety. That's not hunger. That's drug use. So those are the 11 criteria.
Wow. I'm listening, and I know for some of us, there's relief because we're like, oh, that's not me, that's not me. And then for others, we've gotten your attention. So I think
Yeah.
no matter where you fit on that, I think you want to keep listening because, either you're going to be able to help somebody else or you're going to say, I need to get some help in this area. So we're going
Yeah.
to ask you to keep listening. So I
Yeah.
tell you, let me ask you a question. This is what goes through my brain, which is what in the heck makes these perfectly created brains of a human so susceptible to addictions? It just seems like we should just be able to kind of have enough willpower to, overcome those temptations, but it seems that we don't. So what's wrong with our brain that
Okay.
allows this to happen?
So I love this question because people have the impression that our brains are different from primitive brains, and they're only different in one respect. We have a frontal lobe. It's this little tiny, tiny part of the brain. It's about 2% of the brain, and it is marvelous. It can create all kinds of things, everything from skyscrapers to microscopes. Frontal lobes are just incredible and they're a ton of fun. They don't control anything inside the brain. You cannot teach a frontal lobe at 2% of the brain to take control of the other 98% of the brain. It's the neocortex. It's the new cortex. We've only had them for 140,000 years. The rest of the brain has been evolving for 7 million years. So once you understand that 98% of your brain is working the same way it worked 3 million years ago when the midbrain developed, then you know what to do. Because the primitive brain works on a very mechanical system. It sees something or hears something or tastes something or feels something or smells something, and it stores the information. It stores everything associated with that information. So, for example, if you ate something and it nourished you, your neurons take that information from the environment and store it. We ate this, it was this time of year, it was in this place, we could find this place again. It was at this time of day, and it was sunny, So
That
those
sounds like a
factors,
trigger. That sounds like a trigger, you
it
know?
is. It's called a cue
Gotcha.
or a trigger.
Okay.
The other 98% of the brain is running on cues and triggers. It's not able to think. It's not able to analyze or evaluate or decide. All that capability is in the frontal lobe.
You said 98%?
Yes, yes.
Oh
So
my
the
God.
key to everything is to control the cueing.
Wow.
And that's what the addiction scientists know how to do. They control the cueing. They put 500 commercials in front of a toddler's brain and they control the reward centers in that brain. And then by cueing, by recreating the triggers, they can set off an addictive response in that toddler's brain.
It seems like the opposite should be true. So if I create the right environment, for example, at the end of my day, I have vitamins that I take. And my trigger is that I have it on my counter next to where I would typically put my dinner plate.
Right.
So that's my trigger. So that ensures that I take my vitamins. So wouldn't we be able to, as we create habits that serve us, wouldn't it be possible just to surround ourselves by the right triggers? And then, because I always talk about if we have old belief systems that don't serve us, we need to create new belief systems. But even in this context, it's the same thing. Would we
Right.
not be able to then overcome this, or are we kind of stuck with a battle for the rest of our lives?
Well, both, but we can overcome it, and it will always be a battle. So we live in cultures where these addiction scientists are allowed to present cues over and 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 over again for decades. We are in a culture where our government allows these tobacco slash food corporations to use Pavlovian conditioning to teach our neurons to crave their products for profit. So I'm glad you asked this question. This has been the focus of my own work in developing services for overeaters. So, what you're talking about is this surround marketing, and I call it addiction surround marketing, that the tobacco companies created that's documented in their internal documents. We have taken that concept and created an online system where people can have surround positive messaging that blocks out the addiction surround marketing. So you've hit the nail on the head. Controlling these cues, yes, you can do it. Uh, the cues have invaded the household, as I mentioned before. There are a lot of ways in which these addiction merchants have placed cues inside households. Toys in children's meals, kids' meals. That's a cue that's deliberately sent home because the child will associate that trigger. The cue will trigger the addiction in the brain. The child will be craving fast food and begging their parents for it. So it's really quite diabolical, insidious, until you know that it's happening. And we provide, for example, we provide 4 video or conference call events per day. Per day, every day, 365 days a year, because we know the addiction merchants are going to be at it. 360, they get worse on the weekends and holidays. And we provide 2 emails per day, and we provide a Facebook group. So every time somebody comes in contact with us by phone or on their laptop or their tablet, the laptop and tablet and phone become an associated cue for recovery, for exercise and control, for keeping the frontal lobe alive. When somebody has an addiction, the addicted neurons and the stress neurons are so active that it pulls the blood flow from the frontal lobe. And this is why we have these epidemics of attention deficit and learning disabilities and poor decision making and memory loss and poor impulse control. Those neurons are not getting blood flow. The neocortex is not involved in survival. So anytime there's blood flow allocation, the survival parts of the brain are going to get the blood flow, and the neocortex is not going to get anything. So you can't, quote unquote, make a decision. You cannot make a choice. What the frontal lobe can do is create an environment with positive cueing for control, for strength, for power. But that's all going on in the other 98% of the brain. Willpower from the frontal lobe is just a joke. It's like, putting, putting a little kitty up against a mastiff, a furious mastiff. That's not
Yeah,
a fight.
it's not gonna
That's a
happen. Yeah,
slaughter.
that's horrible. And it's like you can't imagine winning that fight. And it sounds like I'm just listening to this ideal of your nerves, and I'm assuming the pathways that connect the nerves. And it sounds like once you create a nerve or a neuron that has a certain kind of message in it or a memory, I'm hearing you say that these things are just there forever. And now we have to spend the rest of our lives not being triggered to activate them. And because it reminds me, one of the reasons why, and this is completely unrelated, I don't watch scary movies anymore. Like,
Oh,
it's not that
good.
I won't watch a scary movie, but I just feel like I don't want that to be in my brain, those negative
Exactly.
thoughts, right? So,
Exactly.
so, so I'm here. So, and what now? I don't want to get off base, but if you have a young person in your life, it seems like if we minimize the negative exposures early in life, they then won't have a life where they are constantly having to fight this battle. Is that an accurate interpretation?
Yes. I wish every parent on the planet were aware of the alterations that can come from watching commercial television, stressful television. Stress and addicted neurons lie very close to each other, which why it looks like stress eating, but it's actually stress activating the addicted neurons that causes the eating. It's not stress itself. It's this intermediate step of addiction. So you can learn a new language through Pavlovian conditioning of neurons. So I speak English. When I was in college, I spent a lot of time learning French. My dad moved us to Belgium when I was like 19 years old. I really threw myself into it. I got quite fluent. Like I could speak to, French speakers. They would not only understand me, but they would really compliment me. I really studied hard. So 40 years goes by. I haven't used my French, but I had occasion where I needed to negotiate something with my stepmom's Belgian relatives, and I went and I thought I'll practice a little bit before I go there. I really stumbled around. It was very, very difficult. They had to pull out their ancient English, and we got it done. So what happened during that time? Those French, the neurons that held the French were not active. And so they weren't used to connecting and producing thoughts. They were rusty, they were out of shape. And so your strategy here is to get your addicted neurons to go into that condition where they're rusty and they're out of
Yeah.
shape and they can't
Yeah.
react anymore.
Yeah.
And in the meanwhile, you want to pack neurons. This is why we have 4 events a day. It's immersion recovery therapy. So if you need to move to a part of the world where they don't speak English, you want to get immersion language programs going, and you want to just listen to nothing but that language until you go, and your neurons will pick it up and you'll be able to speak to some degree. This is the same thing. You want to condition that reward neuron. You want to reprogram it. You want to use Pavlovian conditioning where you repeat, 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 repeat until the neuron acts in a new way. And you do that with this surround positive messaging that we've developed. And what happens is, so if you have learned a new language, like I did really know French, I trained my brain at a cue to come up with a different thought. And I grew up looking at at a car and thinking car. But then I programmed my brain to look at a car and come up with the word voiture. This is exactly the same process. You want that brain, and when you look at something ooey gooey, like, oh, I don't want to even say it, but you look at something really, really addictive. It's very sugary, it's got dairy in it, it's got gluten, and your addicted neuron, thank you very much, tobacco scientists, says, yummy, I want that. So what you're doing is you're retraining that neuron to react with, oh, that will make me so sick. That's all. It's all. It's just
Hmm.
like learning a language.
That's nice. So basically, the longer I stay away from the triggers that negatively activate the neuronal aspects that are not good for me, not serving me, and then I feel it I'm filling my cup with the right stuff, then it seems like over time I'll get stronger. I may still have
Yes.
this weak spot, but I can manage it so much better. And so it's almost like a person losing weight. The longer I stay away from sugary, addictive grains and processed food, etc., the easier it is for me to adapt to this other way with my body. Like I still haven't had food today, and it's like 4 p.m. almost, although I hadn't intended, but I feel fine because my body has been trained to be a faster. Not that that's a good idea. In fact, since I brought that up, I'm not sure fasting is a good idea for a person with this diagnosis. So if a person
No,
truly has
no.
this, because it seems like that could be a problem. So tell me, just speak a little bit about why in this, like if you're a person who's truly meeting these criteria, those 11 things, why intermittent fasting or fasting in general may not be the best approach for that type of person.
Well, it's because once a person has had this experience of these highs of dopamine, serotonin, endocannabinoid, and opiates, that addicted brain will constantly be looking to recreate that obsession. It's trained to be obsessed. It's trained not to know boundaries. It's trained to take the blood supply away from the frontal lobe. So fasting actually it's a kindness. I think it was like a kind of designed to be a kindness to humans who were starving. We know that famine is the leading cause of death on the planet for all time. So if a human were dying of starvation, their brain would be releasing its own painkiller, its own dopamine. And so in the brain of a person who's been addicted, which I hate to say it, but I did the research on this myself, went down into the USDA statistics, United States Department of Agriculture statistics, and added it up. So this is 1997. Americans are consuming over a pound per person per day. That's men, women, and children every day of sugars, mostly high fructose corn syrup, gluten containing flours, high fat dairy, and French fries, fried potatoes. So, half, of course, a third of those people are children, which means the other two thirds are eating more than a pound per person per day. And half, because it's an average, it just means that half the country is eating more than that, quite a bit more of addictive substances every day. I remember when I had a prepared meal company once, we were serving a very high end law firm in Houston, and those lawyers, and so it was clean food. And I would call them up at the end of the week, and I would say, "How was your week? What'd you notice?" "Oh, my cravings seem to be so much better. I'm not having that mid morning, mid afternoon slump, and I'm thinking more clearly." I was shocked. But those highly high functioning people had processed food addiction. So there's nobody, it's not possible for somebody to not have this in, at least in the United States. You would have to be like a hermit and living, off the land directly, because even if you're not ingesting the stuff, you're being bombarded by the queuing. So you've been in a grocery store, or you've driven past a grocery store, if you've driven past fast food outlets with long lines of cars. If you've ever worked in a workplace, it's stuffed with processed foods and people eating processed foods. So the people eating processed foods are just incredible queue. There's I do have to say one more thing, which is the mechanism most responsible for bringing Pavlovian conditioning to neurons is a system in the brain called mirror neurons. And they copy relentlessly, and they copy all the time, because that was the mechanism that kept a human in a tribe, the tribe that found food, shelter, delivered babies, and fought off predators. If you're If you had good mirror neurons and you were copying the people in your tribe, you would live. Your very strong mirror neurons would get passed on. If you had weak mirror neurons and you tended to wander off, well, the tigers and hyenas were waiting for you. You wouldn't be old enough to ever procreate. We are driven by mirror neurons. So I don't want to minimize what it takes to live in our culture and stay protected from this copying impulse. It's called a conformance drive. And we offer a protected environment. It's a video environment. It's a virtual environment, but it works. The brain accepts it because even though the frontal lobe knows about screens, the other 98% of the brain does not know about screens. So you've got to stay in an environment for the rest of your life because the
Wait a
brain
minute,
will.
slow down. So staying in, well, let me just understand, because my brain would say, you have a serious problem. Let's put you into a place where we can surround you by experts and like-minded people who can help you. And now you're saying that maybe it's better to do this at home virtually?
It it has to be done at home because place triggers. So if you go off to a rehab facility, for example, and you do this, your brain cements everything that you learn into that place. You come home and your brain looks around and looks at the cueing. Oh, we're in this place with these people. Well, this is where we binge. Okay, we'll go back to binging now. You've got to do the training in the home. So, for example, I learned French. I go to Paris. Oh, my French is just coming to the surface. All the signs are in French. The people are speaking French. I'm being totally stimulated to speak French. But I fly back to New York, and I no French words are coming to mind because I'm being stimulated to speak English. These are place triggers, and they are powerful.
That makes a lot of sense. And I completely get it. And maybe did you guys, was this virtual thing you're doing happening even before COVID? Because I know most of us converted to virtual. Is this something you just started doing, or had you guys been doing that even before the COVID-19 kicked in?
We started it in January of 2018.
Wow.
So we've been doing it for 2.5 years.
Wow.
And yes, COVID's really scary. We're seeing some data showing that people on average have gained 16
I
pounds.
just heard that.
Yeah,
Crazy in that short amount of
yeah,
time. And it's true. I can tell you empirically, and I've had so much success with low carb with my patients, but even some of my star patients have at the minimum plateau, but many have gained a little weight. So we definitely minimize the blame and say, we get it. If there's ever a time when you're going to struggle, it's during a pandemic. But you're right. That's being at home has had a impact on people that I think maybe it was a little predictable, but it definitely was more than I expected. So
yeah.
it's
Well, I would so tell you a little good news about that. And it's because the restaurants are closed and people are not wandering around lingering
right.
in highly queued grocery store
That's
environments.
true.
We're actually seeing that it's easier because you don't have to negotiate that kind of queuing and people are not socializing. So we've been able to people into our programs and they just so much more rapidly get the queuing inside their homes under control and and then they're not exposed to queuing outside the home except perhaps minimally. So it's actually been quite helpful to us.
Interesting. I'm curious. I know I've shared with my listeners that I'm in a nutrition program. I think we both are in some ways chronic students, which I think is a good thing. But
Yeah.
um, so after I developed a strong foundation in the low carb space and metabolic syndrome. I actually did that foundation before I went to my nutrition program. So when I have a different lens that I see the world through because of that. So when I look at data and the things that we talk about in school, I frame it around my thoughts around low carb and the benefits, and I'm not afraid of fat and things like that. So I'm curious, since you got your PhD training a little later in your journey, how has that changed how you think about processed food addiction? Was it completely additive? Did it, were you questioning a lot of things that were being taught? How did it affect you in your worldview of food addictions?
Oh, that's a nice question. So I had the grace to go to Union Institute and University, which is a school for new fields. And that they required me to go out and recruit my own committee from other schools. So I had almost like a tutorial system, and my mentors were just fascinated with the topic. The doctoral committee worked really hard, and we did end up publishing the first description of refined food addiction in the academic press. So I got super experts and just worked with them individually, and we created our own program. So what I learned from that mostly was how to read research, original research. The breakthrough that I got is that the research is there, and that other researchers had noticed that the brains of overeaters were doing the same things as the brains of drug addicts. So you have this hyperactive reward system, stress system, and pulling the blood supply away from the frontal lobe. The real breakthrough for me came in the 3 years of writing the textbook, almost like, I don't know, like a fellowship, and really getting it deep, deep down on the inside that what we are experiencing has nothing to do with food. It's not a food issue, it's a drug issue. So if you had like a heroin addict and you were pulling them out of it and you had them in treatment, yeah, you would want them to eat really nutritious food, but mostly you would want them to recover from the substance use. And that is what is missing from training. And that is why I have gone into training in a really big way. We have about 60 people now that we are training in substance use recovery. So these are substances that were hidden in food. And the tobacco/food industry was able to divert our attention, make us think it had something to do with eating. But this doesn't have anything to do with eating any more than like smoking has to do with breathing, or cocaine use has to do with snorting, or alcoholism has to do with swallowing. It's not a food issue. It's not a nutrition issue any more than, yes, you would want a recovering alcoholic to have a really good diet. It's a substance use disorder. It's a lot of substances. There's no control over it, and so the food industry. You've got to also remember that the food industry controls the dietitians. 40% of dietitians work for food processors.
40%.
40% of dietitians work for food
Wow.
processors.
Did not know that.
When you go to the dietetics conference, the biggest, like it takes up an acre, maybe not quite, no, I'm exaggerating, but there's Kraft and Nabisco and General Foods. Those are the exhibitors at the diabetics. Sorry, it's now called the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics.
Okay.
It used to be the ADA. They are the food industry, and they control the messaging around what's really going on. And so that's why you see dietitians creating this concept of an eating disorder. There's no such thing as an eating disorder. Anything like if you go into the DSM and you search very carefully, there's 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 the only place you see binge used is in the binge eating disorder diagnosis. There's no binge drinking diagnosis. There's no binge smoking diagnosis. There are no binge diagnoses for substance use disorders. It's just because the American Psychiatric Association cannot see that the problem is these addictive substances that were added to food. So if they associate with food, it looks like the person is eating. They're not eating. They're using. So I come across really frustrated nutritionists all the time. They go to these expensive programs, they spend years out of their lives, they come out, they give people great information, which goes smack up against this malfunctioning or not functioning or dysfunctioning frontal lobe. The nutritionists are taught to teach people. You cannot teach an addict. You can only put an addict in an environment where they can copy. So that's why AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, is so successful. People can go there and they can start to copy people in the fellowship. And that's why our program is successful. It's because we're not asking our people to really learn anything. We're asking them to come into video chats and conference calls where we are working as hard as we can to activate their mirror neurons and to get their mirror neurons to identify us as their tribe as opposed to the advertisers. I
Wow.
don't know. I hope that makes sense,
It
Tony.
makes
I
a
know
lot of
that's a lot
sense.
to absorb. It's a great shift. It's a radical shift, but it's a shift that's really worth fighting for.
I think it is. And what I want to do is, wow. Let me ask you one more question about this topic that's just to provide clarity, and that's the eating disorders versus food addictions. I don't know,
Yeah.
any comments about that, because I think people may get confused or, put those two in the same bucket.
We see people. We have people coming in who are just traumatized by eating disorder programs. I have been taught by my mentors to kind of speak from the evidence and downplay and let people make up their own minds. But I realized in the last couple of years I'm not helping anybody by doing that. It's a radical shift. You know what it's like? In the 1700s, a doctor in a hospital in Vienna discovered that if he washed his hands between patients, they didn't get infected and
Right.
die.
I
He was a
remember that.
surgeon.
Yeah, I remember
And
that.
so he went around to all the other doctors in the hospitals, just wash your hands. Just wash your
Yeah.
hands
Yeah.
between surgeries. And they kicked him out of the
They
hospital.
thought it was crazy. Yeah.
They thought he was not fit to be a surgeon anymore. It was so radical. It was so crazy. So what I'm really asking practitioners to do is wash your hands between surgeries. Help your clients find a way to block out the addiction cueing. Train in how to, create these virtual environments for your patients. It's radical. It's very different, but it is working. We're seeing it work in our programs.
Wow. And I'm very happy that you've figured this out. You had 3 years to kind of do your research and
Yeah,
collect the data. So, sometimes you turn lemons into lemonade. So I really appreciate
yeah,
that time you
yeah,
had. That's the only way I can
yeah.
see it. So I'll ask you my last question, which is the hardest, and it relates to my nest and rope. And of course, that's nutrition, exercise, less stress, more sleep, how we think, avoiding trauma,
hmm
relationships, organisms, avoiding pollution, our emotions, and our environment, or should I say our life experience. So my question is, as you think about the nest and the rope and what you're going to focus on over the next year to help you achieve your ideal state, what do you think you're going to focus on?
So in this environment that we've created, I have been able to dig down through a lot of layers of trauma from my childhood. My parents were addicted, but my father was very successful. He was a corporate executive, a biochemist, and a commander in the Naval Reserves, and a very, very negative person. And my mother was addicted to caffeine and sugar. There was alcohol being consumed every night and lots of caffeine, nicotine. You wouldn't have seen it from the outside, but it was a very addicted and very volatile family and very negative. So those pleasure pathways, which are addicted, that what they're supposed to be doing is identifying sources of pleasure, sources of good, sources of satisfaction. That's what they're designed to do. And so when you repair them, when you retrain them not to be so hyperactive, they actually, it's one of the reasons why depression, irritability, anxiety gets so much better in recovery from drug use. These substances are also create a lot of volatility in blood glucose. So what got me into this field almost 25 years ago was I stopped raging. So my blood glucose stabilized because I wasn't eating these refined carbohydrates anymore, and I stopped raging. Well, my parents were ragers, and because their pleasure pathways were shut down, they were not able to perceive anything good in me. And so the comments were always derogatory, shameful, disdaining, bullying, critical, just, I have grown up with a negative opinion about myself as a result. But now so a lot of what we teach is positivity. If you have a positive brain, that's a brain that's not in pain. Pain triggers addiction. Pain triggers loss of control. So we're teaching people to think positively about themselves. And even though I've been in here for 2.5 years, I've just uncovered a very subtle, low-lying doubt in myself, which I associate with shame, because my parents would tell me I was a mess up and shame me about it. So that's what I'm going to be working on in the next year.
And it makes sense. It makes sense because of what you taught us today in terms of those neurons. They're just in you, and you can't get rid of them. They're just there.
You can reprogram them. You can
Man,
reprogram them.
yeah, thank God.
Yeah.
Wow. So that's powerful. I really appreciate you sharing a personal story as we're
Yeah.
kind of wrapping up, and also just providing a way for us to think outside the box. And
Yeah.
I think I see things differently when I learned
Oh,
about your
thank you.
work. I mean, you have no idea. I mean, the things that we do to influence each other, and what kind of helped me to become a better doc was that I was willing to think outside the box. So for
Thank
anybody
you.
listening, please, guys, if you're listening, whether you're a patient, a clinician, think outside the box. Be willing to. You can't hear this information and not say, I got to at least dig a little deeper.
Yeah.
So I just want to say that. But let me ask you this. This is a real last question. When it comes to resources that you have, what's the best way for the person listening to acquire some resources to help them along their journey if they think that these 11 criteria fits who they are or somebody they love?
Well, I'm just going to be really open here. We do have the cutting edge program on the planet. So
Gotcha.
I don't know any other way to say it. Foodaddictionreset.com. You can go there, you can take that little self-test for the addiction, and then our programs, the Addiction Reset Community, you can join that program. It's very reasonable. And then that's where you can get the level of treatment that I think most people need. And we have a big group of trained, we call them advocates. They're peer support people. And then we do offer also training. I have that Stanford Business School degree.
Yes.
So what I'm working on is giving people jobs. I am giving them training in how to speak kindness, and options and thoughtfulness and really deep listening. Everybody who comes in, everybody who's a food addicted person has also experienced some kind of trauma. And so we are training not just health professionals, but lay people. And that website is Food Addiction Recovery Advocates. And we will open up actually another training in September of 2020. We open up training about every 3 months.
That's great. Thank you for that, because I know if I had heard any of this and it resonated with me, I'd want to know how. So thank you again. And I really appreciate this. And again, we will continue our conversation in a moment. But for many of you who are listening, you want to make sure, I'm sure, to have, maybe a little bit more information, actionable steps. Well, no worries, because, and you'll see this in the show notes, but Joan has agreed to spend some time with us in our post-podcast Facebook, YouTube live session. And we'll review the diagnostic criteria. She's given me some slides that she's going to share. And I think we'll have some practical tips that we can apply what we've learned and add that extra layer of, okay, now that I know this, what do I do about it? So again, we'll have a link. And make sure when you go to YouTube for the first time, if you haven't been to my channel, subscribe to the channel, because most of my guests are going to probably do a YouTube after the podcast. And that'll provide additional content, and I think will add tremendous value. So today we learned how to think outside the box a little bit, and some principles related to processed food addiction, which for some of us was pretty new. And I truly believe that this may be and will be life-changing information for some of you. So make sure to share this episode, because there's so many people who need to hear it. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I am so happy that I was able to introduce the doctor to all of you. And so I do advise, I think at Food Addiction Reset, there is a food addiction self-quiz. So if you're wanting to kind of do that, and thank you for having that. I didn't take the quiz yet, but I'm going to do that just for fun. And hopefully I'll pass, but either way, I know that I have a resource in you. So again, thank you again, Doctor, for being here. And for all those who are listening, I want to thank you for listening to this episode of Protecting Your Nest. And I ask all of you to stay well and to continue to protect your nest.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Hampton.
Absolutely. You're a friend for life. You've been listening to Protecting Your Nest with Dr. Tony Hampton. For more, visit drtonyhampton.com.